Okay, hello friends, and welcome to the final shiur of the year at the Chabura. It is also the final installment of our series where our Talmidim take over. Last week we had our dear Avner Yeshurun explore Agada, and tonight we have with us our longtime Chabura member, Daniel Osen. We'll be exploring the role of Targum Onqelos in the study of Miqra. About our speaker, Daniel is an alum of Yeshivat Torah ve'Avodah. He has previously studied at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and at Bar Ilan University. He is currently a student at Yeshiva University, studying towards a BA in Jewish Studies at Yeshiva College and towards an MA in Bible from the Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies. As mentioned, this is the final class for the year, and we are excited for our new program, which we have recently launched. So make sure to check that new curriculum out and make sure to join. Membership to the Chabura offers you access to our exclusive weekly classes, participation in our journals and books, and our international network of students and teachers. Most importantly, though, membership helps support us, ensure that we're able to continue our hard work spreading and making accessible, relevant, and cutting-edge Torah, and specifically the vision of classical Sephardi approach available. We are a nonprofit organization, and all money generated goes back to our programming. So even if you don't really see yourself participating in all of the features membership offers, you would still be supporting our programming and cutting-edge Torah and making the classical Sephardi approach available. With that said, thank you so much all for being here in person and for all those who will be listening after. And Danielle, thank you so much for taking the time and sharing with us. It's an honor, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ahad. Appreciate the warm welcome and introduction. So today's shiur is going to be partially about the role of Targum Onqelos in the study of Miqra, but also the background in which why we even need a Targum in the first place, and of course how that translates into halacha in our own time. Obviously, if anyone has any questions along the way, feel free to put them in the chat. I obviously prefer to go through them all at one shot at the end, but if they're immediately relevant, then don't hesitate to ask. So just share screen for a second. Let's see. Okay, here we go. So start at the top. So of course we have to ask a very preliminary question. This is why we even need a Targum in the first place. So after the Churban Bayit Rishon and the Jews are exiled to Babylon and dispersed across all other places, during the Shivat Zion period, during the rule of Cyrus the Great, when they come back, they have a very real problem. At the end of Sefer Nehemiah, Nehemiah describes the descendants of the Shavei Zion as being, basically speaking, Chatzim medaber Ashdodit, ve'enam makirim ledaber Yehudit. So they can't really speak Hebrew or Yehudit fluently, and even the languages they do speak, because they're so get that down. So that already presents a real need. A few prakim before, in a very, say, stirring and dramatic episode, Ezra reads the from Sefer Torah before the entire Kahal, and more importantly, at the very end, there's this whole procession of the Levim and Kohanim who also interpret the Torah for the people, and most importantly, at the end, Sefer Torah Elohim Forash. So they read from the Torah in a understandable manner, and ultimately they taught the people how to understand it. And the Gemara, I forget where specifically, breaks down this pasuk into different components, how they would explain the meaning of the different laws, and specifically Meforash refers to the Targum. So of course, in that point in time, the dominant language, not just in Yerushalayim, but also across the Near East, was Aramaic. It was the language of the Syrians, the Babylonians to varying degrees, and of course, it was the administrative language of the Persians that followed them. So they rendered the Torah into the vernacular so that it could be understood by everyone. And this need for that obviously continues as Aramaic and later on Greek become more and more prevalent in the region. In the times of the Mishnah, we already see the practice that is attributed by the Chachamim to Ezra Sofer. You see the Mishnah Megillah, הקורא בתורה לא יפחות משלושה פסוקים, לא יקרא לתורגמן יותר מפסוק אחד. So the way that would work is in the ancient synagogue, you would have your koreh, the person who'd be called up to the Torah. The koreh would recite, just for simplicity's sake, by the Be'er Adonai Moshe Lemor, and then the Turgaman would read back to the Kahal, Umalela Adonai Moshe Lememar, right? Back and forth, one verse Hebrew, one verse Aramaic, because at that point there were no fluent biblical Hebrew speakers walking around. You're already a solid 500, 600 years removed from the tail end of the biblical period. So that need obviously arises. And not only that, you have to deal with another problem, which is, of course, the Second Temple period is rife with lots of Jewish sectarianism. You have all these different groups of all sorts of unusual beliefs. Obviously, the Dead Sea sect is the most famous of them. All the materials we found at Qumran that shed light on the, shall we say, the wide range of beliefs that existed amongst Jews of the late Second Temple period. So, of course, it's one thing to have a Turgaman, but how do you have a proper translation, or what makes a translation good? So in the Gemara, there are two, one in the Bavli, one in the Yerushalmi. You have two separate, but obviously very closely linked accounts, which deal with how we end up with this thing that we call Targum Onqelos in our day. So Bavli and Miqra, Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, Itmar Rabbi Chaya bar Abba, Targum Shel Torah, Onqelos Hager Amaro Mipi Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yoshua. So, according to the Gemara, specifically Rabbi Chaya bar Abba, Targum of the Torah was presented by Onqelos Hager for Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yoshua the Tanaim. The Yerushalmi gives a slightly different account. Rabbi Yirmiyah V'Shem Rabbi Chaya bar Abba. Don't worry about the names being slightly different. That happens all the time in the Yerushalmi and the Bavli. Elazar becomes Lazar and so forth. Tirgem Onqelos Hager Torah Lifnei Rabbi Eliezer Lifnei Rabbi Yoshua V'Kidusu Oto Yavitit Mibnei Adam. So Onqelos Hager translated the Torah in front of Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yoshua, and they praised him for his efforts, calling him, the most beautiful of mankind. So obviously, you're forced to confront, how do we have two very clearly similar statements between the two Talmudim? One, which attributes the Targum to Onqelos Hager, and the other to Onqelos Hager. And to my mind, and there's been a lot written on this, that really Onqelos and Onqelos are one and the same. That shift between the ayin and the aleph, and sometimes the occasional nun that you see, especially in differences between Hebrew and Aramaic, pop up quite a bit. So there's fair reason to assume that Onqelos and Onqelos are one and the same. You can even hear it in just the sound of the names themselves. For all intents and purposes, the Targum we're going to be dealing with it doesn't matter per se whether the fellow's name is Onqelos or Onqelos, because they are one and the same. My English name is Daniel. My Hebrew name is Yitzchak. But obviously, in context, we're talking about the same person. So, what makes Targum Onqelos so special, or what made it so praiseworthy in the eyes of Chazal? So the first and foremost aspect is that it's a very, very conservative translation. What I mean by that is that it tries very, very hard to stick to the peshat of the text. There's obviously some interpretation, because any form of translation is going to be interpretive. It's the nature of the beast. But Onqelos strives very, very hard to maintain and retain the plain sense of what he's working with. So let's start with a example that's familiar to all of us in the beginning of Bereshit, when God creates humanity. Etc., etc. So can even first and foremost, fortunately, the formatting here maybe just a little one of these now. Okay, my luck is not on my side. The point is that if you compare with the actual verse, you can just see from the word count that the Onqelos side here on the right versus what's called sometimes the Targum Yonatan. It's not really, whether academically or even traditionally, Chazal say that the Targum from the Nevi'im was written by Yonatan. They make it very clear that the Targum on the Torah is by or Targum Pseudo Jonathan or what have you. But Onqelos here on these verses starts Amar Adonai Na'aved Nasha Besamana Kitana Vishatum Beno Yama Benuna Yama V'Ofa Dishmai V'Eyo Dechol Ara V'Chol Rach Shad Rachish Ad Ara. So, in other words, Onqelos makes one ever so tiny change in the first pasuk, which is he, instead of saying Elohim, he says uses Shem Hashem. Fine, and so forth. Especially with that pasuk where there's a real rhythm to it, you can hear that Onqelos also preserves the rhythm by rendering it as a word-for-word translation. On the other hand, and just to clarify, the Targum Yerushalmi is one of the written sources we have, but obviously, everyone who is fluent enough between the two languages was more than capable of presenting their own Targum interpretation in public. And I think Targum Yerushalmi is a good representative sample of what alternatives may have looked like in late antiquity. So instead, Targum Yerushalmi renders it as Va'amar Elohim already, right off the bat, huge difference. And it addresses a real problem that many Mefarshim have struggled with, which is why is it Na'aseh Adam B'Tsamenu Kidmuthenu and not Na'aseh Adam B'Tsami Kidmuthi or something along those lines? Why is it in the first person plural? So Targum Yerushalmi resolves that very simply by saying God spoke to the angels that serve him that he created on the second day of creation, so on and so forth. And while that is, that's a fair interpretation, there's nowhere in the pasuk itself where you could necessarily read that out from. And similarly, as it gets even more dramatic, the difference is more dramatic for the following pasuk, where it says that God created man in his image, and it goes on to say that he created him with 248 ivarim, appendages or limbs, and with mea v'shitin v'chamisha gidin, with 365 ligaments. And afterwards, God covers that entity with skin and fills it with flesh and blood. Now it's a very nice, and it's sort of, when you talk about understanding, Ma'aseh Bereshit as it is, it tries to get into the actual process of creation. But Onqelos and the pasuk itself, quite honestly, is not especially interested in that, which is why it renders it word for word. Another good example of this, and those who are very familiar with the Chaburanis general culture will know exactly why I'm using this pasuk as an example. And when Chava and the Nachash are talking, or Nachash is trying to persuade Chava to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that he says that so Targum, famous, of course, could lead to all sorts of confusion. Because and obviously in modern academia, people are more inclined to read that as that it is a story of how by eating from the fruit that they will gain the same abilities essentially as God or become divine entities, whereas Onqelos renders it as Rav Ravin, i.e. political rulers or powers, or people who have the capacity to wield authority and violence. And similarly, the pseudo Jonathan also renders it similarly, but with one slight caveat. V'tehon kimal achin Rav Ravin, etc., that they will be like the angels who have such authority and so forth. Now, it's not to say that there's a presumption that they would become angelic beings, but rather they would function similarly to angelic beings. But of course, with the Targum Onqelos, that confusion is entirely cut out. And similarly, same here with in Bereshit Vav, right before the Mabul, Vayu b'nei Elohim et b'not Adam. When it talks about these b'nei Elohim, once again, Onqelos translates it as b'nei Rav Ravaya. And this particular point is, of course, essential in the kind of polemics that exist in late antiquity, where you have groups that do talk about weird scenarios, get very obsessed with angels and demons and their influence in the world. For those of you who are more familiar with the Apocrypha, the book of Enoch, right, deals with Hanoch and his ascent into heaven and all the various angels, and how angels would involve themselves here and how humans can involve themselves there. And for that reason, in Bereshit Rabbah, Elohim, Rabbi Shimon bar ben Yochai, Kara lahom bnei Layana. Okay, so Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai says explicitly that these are the sons of judges or political leaders, and not any kind of supernatural divine human hybrid. And also, all the more so in a context where Christianity has just emerged, emphasizing that these are pure people and there's no room for this divine human hybrid business, is of course all the more crucial. In fact, Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai mekalel v'chol man dikara lahom b'nei Elahaya. So Rabbi Shimon Yochai curses anyone who would call them Ibnei Elahaya, who would call them the sons of God or the sons of divine beings for that reason. Another aspect of Targum is, of course, its approach to anthropomorphisms in the Torah, which, of course, are scattered throughout and about. If I were to, you could do an entire shiur on that subject unto itself, but just as a handful of examples, so let's know this pasuk from our day to day. That right after Kriyat Yam Suf, Israel see of God that God did in Egypt, and they fear God and they believe in God and his servant Moshe. And once again, Onqelos shies away from that, because obviously saying that Israel saw the hand of God raises a lot of problematic questions very quickly. So instead, for the public, it becomes Guvrat Yad Rabbadah, that it becomes the strength or the power of God, or the great strength and power of God that he did in Egypt. And more importantly, even generally, where Torah will say the phrase Et Hashem, it will remember. Onqelos prefers the min kadam Hashem, that is before God, that rather that God being a direct object of a verb, that there is a degree of separation, that we are before God and not, they weren't fearing God directly, but they were afraid before God. The semantics are a little ticky-tacky, but that is, but at the same time, that the difference between us being able to do something directly with God versus from maintaining that relational humility, that we are simply before God, and that God is not something we interact with directly as a substance or anything like that, is also part of the running motif. A very important example, and one that, of course, comes up a lot in terms of the anthropomorphism debate in the Torah, is in Shemot Kaf Daled, where it describes very explicitly Vayu'et Elohei Yisrael tachat raglo k'ma'aseh libnat hasapir v'cha'ezem hashamayim latahor. So they say that they see whether bottoms of his feet are like the made of lapis or that color, and like the sky in its, or the heavens in its most pure form. Ve'el atzilei bnei Yisrael lo shalach yodo vayechazu et Elohim vayechulu vayishtu. And you know, they see this, right? There's a recurring notion that if you see God, you die. So to the princes or the leaders of Bnei Israel, nothing happens, and specifically it says vayechazu et Elohim, and then they rejoice. So of course this is a tremendous interpretive problem, especially if you are of the camp that correctly believes that God does not have a physical form. So here, when it deals with issues like this, Onqelos renders it as Bechazuyat Yikar Elahadi Yisrael, that they saw the glory of God, but not God himself. And similarly, that they, rather than Tachat Raglav, it becomes the bottom of his throne, i.e., not so much his physical feet as it is the image of the divine throne, which you see in the Nevi'im and Yeshayahu and Yechezkel. And similarly, for the following pasuk, when it struggles with the very explicit, by Chazut Elohim, the same thing happens. And furthermore, that it's not just that they see his glory, but as a result of it, they sacrifice korbanot, and they rejoice over the fact that those korbanot are accepted, as if they were eating and drinking before God. Now, as you can just see even visually, without even getting into the meat of the text itself, Sue Jonathan has a totally wildly and very, very interesting take on this whole thing. The problem is, Targum Jonathan essentially takes this whole episode and turns it into a midrash about Nadav and Avihu, who are going to die shortly. I know there's a lot of text that happens in between now and when they die, but they die pretty close to after Ma'amad Har Sinai. And it turns us into a whole midrash about what they did wrong that essentially set them up to fail in the Mishkan, which in turn becomes a pirush on why they died, what they did wrong later. But as interesting, and maybe, dealing with these types of midrashim is a class unto itself, that it doesn't really square with anything that we see in the psukim above. Now, in terms of another realm, and I admit this is not personally my area of expertise, but of course, the role of Targum Onqelos in halacha, or maintaining, I apologize, I knew I was missing something, but let me just, so in Vayikra, you have, when it describes Sukkot, and Parak Gimel, so of course the question very quickly is, what are any of those things? Some of them are more self-explanatory, like Kavot Marim, Anaf Eis Avot, V'Arvei Nachal. But what is Piri Eis Hadar? So, Onqelos there, and I apologize. Bear with me for a brief moment. So specifically, Onqelos there describes Pri Eis Hadar, which can mean, in theory, anything. Was it the fruit of a nice tree, a fruit of fruit from a tree? The fruit itself is beautiful, whatever the question is. But Onqelos very open and shut simply says, consistent with the rabbinic interpretation, that Pri Elana Ethrogin, that is you're taking an ethrog. And of course, there are a litany of other examples of this throughout the Torah. But for our sake, for time, and also freely admit that my expertise is in slightly different aspects of this, that you can go through the more halachic parts of the Torah, and you'll see things where Onqelos bypasses, as it were, the pshat, and then very quickly make sure that the rabbinic interpretation of a specific commandment is in place. For ourselves, of course, there is this thing that we are all familiar with, the practice of Shnai Miqra ve'echad Targum. That every week you should, complete the parasha, read it twice, and once with Targum Onqelos. So, of course, where does that itself come from? Obviously, it's not certainly not one of the 613, but at the same time, it is a chobah that is found in the Talmud in Berachot. Amar Rav Huna bar Yuda Amar Rabbi Ameh Le'olam yeshlim adam parshiota im hasibur shenai mikra ve'echad targum. Okay, very open and shut. You have, in the name of Rabbi Ameh, brought down by Rav Huna bar Yuda, that a person should always complete his parshiot with the kihila, shnai mikra ve'echad targum, ve'afilu atarot v'divot shekol mashlim parshiotav einu sibur ma'arichin lo yamo shnatav. So this even pertains to atarot v'divon, which is a reference to a specific pasuk in the Midbar, where Bnei Ruvain, Shevet Ruvain, and Gad are going up to Moshe and saying, "These are the cities that we conquered from the Amori that we want to settle in on the opposite side of the Yarden. Atarot v'divon, Yazev, Nimra, Bechashbon, V'na'aleh, Ushvam, V'vo, V'an." Right, though that's just a list of the cities. There's not a whole lot to translate there. It's a real estate listing, and so forth. Onqelos, the Targum Onqelos does not really have a lot to say, because what's there to say? I mean, when translating place names, right, you usually go to, if I were translating into, if I were translating, say Philadelphia into Hebrew, I would write it as Philadelphia. I wouldn't write it as, Ira Havat Achim or something like that. That would be, at least to me, that would be a little too literal for the sake of the overall picture of what you're trying to accomplish. However, most of us are familiar, actually, and you'll see in a lot of printed editions of Miqra Gdolot, that it prefers that there's a preference for the Targum Yishalmi, which actually has specific translations for this verse, and the reason for that we will discuss momentarily. So Harambam Mishneh Torah Hilchot Tefillah posek that אף על פי שאדם שומע כל התורה כולה בכל שנתו בציבור חייב לקרוא לעצמו בכל שבוע ושבוע סדר של אותו שבת שניים מקרא ואחד תרגום. Same deal, basically. One of the great things about studying the Mishneh Torah is where you can see basically where Harambam almost cuts and pastes the language of the Talmud, puts it in and either leaves it unchanged or just puts it into Hebrew. And this is a great example of that. Ufasuk she'en lo targum, korehu shelosha pa'amim ad sheshim parshiotav ha'im hatzibur. And a pasuk that doesn't have a Targum, such as Atarot v'Divon, you read 3 times until you complete the parsha with the sibur. Now, of course, fighting over whether are you technically reading it 3 times or you're reading it once still in the Targum is not really so important. If you want to break your head over that, that's fine, but that's not really central to the issue at hand. That really, at the end of the day, if there's something that there's no Targum, you read 3 times. So just to clarify, that's not even limited specifically to this verse, where there are things like Birkat Kohanim, which technically don't have a Targum, or other portions of the Torah. There's a list that appears in Masechet Megillah that we don't, even though there might be a Targum for them, that you don't necessarily recite in public. But that is a entirely separate question. So Tur or Chaim, once again, brings same halacha, but almost exactly copies paste the Gemara with a slightly different girsa. But be that as it may, the real change is where you see in the latter half of the first serif, and same too in the second. So similar to Harambam, or I guess before Harambam, Rashi writes that, even though if there's a pasuk that doesn't have a Targum, you read it 3 times. However, there are those who take a different approach, namely Rabbeinu Tam. So since there are Sfarim shekatuv bahem Targum Yerushalmi, ונקט עטרות ודבלון אף על פי שאין צריכים כל כך תרגום, ולפי זה ראובן ושמעון אין צריך לקראתו 3 פעמים, and so on and so forth. So for certain things where there's no actual direct translation, or that the Yerushalmi has a different interpretation of these, but at the same time writes that we are accustomed to be mahmir in accordance with the view of Rashi. And the real game changer is here, where he writes, "Im lamad haparasha b'ferashi hashiv kemo targum she'ein kavanat hatargum ela she'yavin ha'inyan aval im kore b'sha'an az lo." And if someone studies with Rashi's commentary, it is thought of as though it is the Targum itself, as the intent of the Targum is that you should understand what you are reading. And if you read in any other language, then you have not fulfilled your obligation. And Moran, of course, later in Shulchan Aruch, writes similarly, Imamad parasha b'ferush Rashi, Hashiv kamo Targum, Vireh Shamayim Miqra Targum, v'gam Ferush Rashi. And here we have an interesting development where the later Posukim attribute the commentary of Rashi as having the same exact status functionally as that of the Targum. Now, this to me is, a classic divide that you see in a lot with practices or halachot that might not be as narrowly applicable in our times, but it's a question of whether it's the form of the halacha, i.e., using Targum Onqelos specifically, or whether it is about the function, which is to understand what you are reading. So the incorporation of Rashi, which became, and still is, the most widespread commentary on the Torah that there ever has been, really, in Jewish circles at least, that it's not surprising that people would say that you can adopt it as such, because that is the prism through which people would study Torah. That being said, and this is my opinion, obviously, like most other people here, I grew up, the Chumashim I used when I was in elementary school had basically the text of the Torah and Rashi on the bottom. This is not a knock on him, but I don't think that functionally they are one and the same. But be that as it may, if someone wants to, take any perush honestly and say that, I'm going to dedicate myself in each and every week to learn the parasha with this perush, then, by all means, I think it's a wonderful thing. And, broadening a sense of understanding the various issues or interpretive issues that appear and arise in the text is always a good thing. Side note that I would just like to make is if you are going to elect to still use Rashi in lieu of Targum, is just making sure that my screen's shifted to the other tab. Yeah. Okay. So another important thing when you are studying, and once again, the Chabura, this is something that comes up a lot, is that when you are studying a text, any text whatsoever, you want a good version of the text, a good girsah, because you want to know what the text is actually saying and not maybe what some later copyist had to say to it. So this mgketer.org, it's Bar Ilan's Miqra Gdolot, which is critical edition based on Keter Sova, and also all the Perushim have been, edited in accordance with various manuscripts. And that, of course, can have dramatic ramifications for how we understand or are taught certain things. So in Perek of Zayin, Bereshit, okay, so Rashi famously addresses why did Yitzchak go blind. So he provides a first answer, which is Be'oshnan Shel Elu, i.e. the Avodah Zarah that the wives of Esav were doing, Al-Pi Midrash Chuma, and Davar Acher from Bereshit Rabbah, She'yitol Yaakov et HaBerachot. That it's a functional plot device that Yaakov should end up with the Berachot. Now, of course, the one that stays with a lot of people and one that is the interpretation, Davar Acher, this long midrash about how when Yitzchak was on the Mizbeach, found on the Mizbeach, that the Malchei Asharet would cried into his eyes, and the damage over time from the tears is what ultimately blinded him. However, this portion is actually in brackets, and the brackets in this edition are the way of signifying this is something that does not appear in the earliest manuscripts, but rather only appears in later editions, and was probably, sometimes you see what happens with printed works is quite often that you have the original text, then a copyist will make all these different notes and their own opinions, and then later on a second copyist will be like, well, they can't tell which is which, so they have to just include everything because you want to err on the side of caution. But that's a great way of sifting through what is and what isn't. Just as some concluding remarks, when it comes to using the Targum, there are obviously what we'll call the functional benefits. So I will speak from personal experience. When I was in middle school, and Baruch Hashem, that Hebrew was not something I struggled with, but once they threw in this whole Aramaic business, things became very different. And especially like with the Targum, just familiarizing myself with the differences of vocabulary really just helped me in that respect. But more than that, I think that because Aramaic, and especially the Aramaic that is used in the Targum, is so closely related to Hebrew, that you're not just thinking in terms of one language, but you're also thinking in terms of both simultaneously. I know Faur, Alav Shalom, wrote about this aspect of it extensively, that you're not limiting yourself to just being narrowly confined to the text, reading the text and just, mumbling the words over and over and over again, but you're actually understanding it. And even if you don't speak Aramaic, the interplay between the two texts, something I've asked people who speak a lot more languages than I do, I asked them, if you were to ask me, total novice, what would be the easiest way for me to learn the language? And it'd be like very simple. You open up, Sefer Bereshit, and you start from there, and you get everything very quickly because it's extremely familiar to you. And so to hear that with the Aramaic, and especially because of how similar they are and how the semantics carry over pretty neatly from one to the other, that there's tremendous value in not just being able to understand the text, but also to think almost in two separate but interconnected tracks about the same exact text. Obviously, the recitation of the Targum in public is something that has, with a handful of exceptions, primarily the Jews of Yemen, and from as my memory serves, there's some Kurdish communities that preserve the practice of reciting the Targum in public. But it also, instead, the Torah is something that is a text that you are engaging with, and not just a song set to a particular set of words. Thank you.
Wow, Daniel, very well presented, very insightful. Thank you so much. We're now open for questions, comments, criticisms. You can yell at him. So if you want, you can unmute or write your question in the chat box. Raise your hand.
Put your questions in all caps if you don't feel comfortable yelling at me personally, but want to convey the same effect. The options are open.
I'll start off by maybe not a question, but just a point, which is, as you pointed out, how many times the Targum is not actually trying to give over the Torah in a different language as it is, but more what the understanding of the Chumash is, what the Miqra is, meaning, and he tries very hard to keep it within the bounds, the rabbinic bounds. So there's almost an assumption that the audience is someone who is not going to study on his own, meaning he needs to sort of be handed that over. Like the Torah, meaning the Torah wrote it certain things in misleading ways, meaning that's how it clearly wanted to present it. It could have done a much better job. So when the Targum comes and does, so the assumption is that the audience is not going to do their own study.
Right, and this is, look, we live in an era of like unparalleled widespread Torah literacy. Like what we have now, where the expectation is for a lot of people, and in school systems that are just bigger than they ever have been before, that the Chachamim were of a separate scholarly class from the rest of the people. Most people did not speak Hebrew. There's a great Teshuvah of Harambam where someone writes specifically saying I'm trying to study the Torah, but I can't speak Hebrew, so I'm relying on Saadia Gaon's translation, and I just want to know, I feel really guilty and self-conscious about that fact because, I want to be able to read the original, but I can't. But ultimately, Rambam writes is that it's not about the specific form. It's about the fact that you are understanding what the text says, and that you'd much rather be able to understand what the text says than to be able to read it for the sake of being able to read it in a performative way. In terms of just other things, I will note that there are times where the Targum deviates wildly from the Peshat, such famously in more prophetic sections, like the end of Bereshit with Yaakov's Berachot is one example, or more famously in Ha'azinu. If you read the Targum in Ha'azinu, it's like you're reading an entirely different book because it's much more. You can open up and see for yourself, but the contents are, it treats it as a prophetic work, and therefore it is trying to match various elements of the Shirah onto various happenings or future happenings in the history of Am Yisrael.
In your opinion, is there a specific benefit in using the Onqelos, or let's say today, English would be better?
So look, I think not that, as I said, I'm more of the not just form over function, but I would argue that the form is the function, and that on the one hand, yes, you can use an English translation to help you, but there's obviously a wide range, not just in quality, but also you can find, even with different, every English translation, of course, is marketing to a different audience. You'll have, say, ArtScroll, which is marketing one way, Koran, which is marketing, or JPS, which is marketing a third way. And that's even before you get to like more conventionally academic translations. So while those are good tools, I think it is also important to really read the Torah as Chazal understood it, which is, a lot of time, for example, ArtScroll sometimes will, and this is not a knock on them, they're very open, by the way, for all the criticisms of ArtScroll's translations. They are very open about their methodologies, but they'll say, oh, we, generally, and when ambiguity arises, we try and see if, Rashi fits the best with the text, and then we'll translate according to Rashi if that's the case. But of course, that means you're reading, in a sense, you're reading Rashi's commentary on the Torah, just repackaged in different words or in a different language. So if you can work with the Aramaic 100%, that, in every English, obviously, I don't think there's such a thing as a perfect translation, and I don't think I ever expect to see one, but, some are better than others, but obviously different people are looking for different things. Yeah, that's, if there are any other questions?
Anyone else? Okay. So I think we'll close it with that. Danielle, what a great way to end the year of the Chabura.
Thank you. I was admittedly feeling, especially after Rabbi Dweck's Q&A on Monday, which was a tough act to follow. I hope I did passably.
No,
that was
for
excellent.
sure.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Daniel. Yeah,
Thank
great.
you.
And what's important over here with this series, with the Talmidim taking over, is that it's important not only to be, on the sidelines being a pawn, but also being an actor and being active and actually taking the role and leading. So thank you, Danielle. And thank you so much, everyone, for an incredible year. It was really incredible to be a part of this. And we'll see you on the flip side for the next curriculum. And make sure to sign up for that. And Laila Tov, everyone. Thank you so much.
Yep. Thanks, Daniel. Great.
Thanks, Daniel.
My pleasure.